So, continuing on with this month's strategy theme of C'tan Shards, this week we're talking about how you can get the most out of your C'tan Shard of the Deceiver. That's coming right up. Welcome back, great to have you here. If this is your first time here, here's what's up. If you want to improve your wargaming, make your tabletop battles more epic, and give your wargaming budget more power, then be sure to smash the subscribe button below and ding the bell. That way you won't miss anything. Now let's jump straight into talking about the C'tan Shard of the Deceiver and how you can get the most out of it on the battlefield. Okay, so this time we're talking about the Deceiver. Now, the Deceiver has the same stat line as the Nightbringer. It's got an 8-inch move, 2 up weapon skill, 2 up ballistic skill, strength 7, toughness 7, 8 wounds, 4 attacks, 10 leadership, 4 up invulnerable save. So like the Nightbringer, it's quite durable. You can bubble wrap it, which is awesome. If you don't have the extra points for Scarabs, you can also bubble wrap it with Warriors. Very effective. Put a blob of 20 Warriors in front of the Deceiver, and your opponent will have a hard time getting through to it. Now, the Deceiver, unlike the Nightbringer, is not meant for destroying stuff in close combat. It's still quite potent in close combat, but that's not its primary focus. So let's get the close combat aspect out of the way real quick. It also has powers of the C'tan, like the Nightbringer, which again, I like the Antimatter Meteor and the Seismic Assault. Not a huge fan of the Time's Arrow, for reasons I mentioned in the Nightbringer video, which you can find up here. Now, in close combat, it has the Star God's Fist, which is a melee weapon. It's strength user, so it's got a strength of 7, quite effective. Again, I'd wish that they'd given him strength 8, just so that it was a bit more effective against land raiders, but strength 7 is still quite good. As well as strength 8 would mean that they'd be wounding Space Marines on 2-ups rather than 3-ups, which would be quite enjoyable. Now, it's AP -4 again, so you're not given much saves to many things, and it does a flat 3 damage, which I much prefer over the D3 or D6 damage of the Nightbringer, just because it's something I can rely on. As some of you may have seen in my first 8th edition battle report, he's pretty good at close combat at taking down stuff. Just because he does have that straight up 3 damage, he's quite potent. Now, this is where the Deceiver becomes interesting and becomes a bit more tricksy. Now, he's got Dread, so if your opponent's within 12 inches of your Deceiver, then he's adding 1 to his morale checks, which is quite useful, especially against stuff with lower model count. So let's say you're up against a unit of 5 Grey Knights, and you kill 4 of them, and all that's left is the Justicar. So he's only failing that morale check on a 6. With the Deceiver around, it's a 5. You have just doubled your chances of making him run off the table. That is how this sort of power is quite powerful. And with a 12-inch bubble, plop him in the middle of the table, bubble wrap him, and your opponent is not going to have a good time trying to get you off an objective or whatever is there that you've plopped him on. Now, where the Deceiver becomes really fun is with Grand Illusion. So, at the beginning of the first battle round, before the first turn has begun, so this is after deployment but before anyone has started moving anything or doing stuff, you get to relocate the Deceiver and D3 other things, so between 1 and 3. So you can rely on the Deceiver and at least 1 other model being moved. Huh? You see what I'm saying? And you can place it anywhere on the table, provided you're more than 12 inches away from your opponent. So this can be a really effective way to break your enemy lines turn 1, or even you've broken your enemy lines before the game has even really started. Very powerful, because it can throw your opponent's rhythm off from word go. The thing you do have to keep in mind is that if you relocate, say, Lychguard or Enrikier or close combat stuff, it's not allowed to charge, even though in its first turn it would be able to move and would technically be within 12 inches and according to the charge rules be allowed to charge. It specifically says it's not allowed to charge. So what I like to do is put monoliths or night scythes nice and close, and then you can pop stuff out if you really want to get close combat stuff up there quickly. And in the case of the monolith deep striking in, if you were to do that, it means that it's exposed for one less turn before you can get the stuff out of it. So that can work. It's not ideal, just because it means you are 12 inches away and then they're disembarking, and because they're coming in from reserve, they're not allowed to move, which is a bit of a pain. But hey, that's the way it works sometimes. Hopefully when we get the Codex, the monolith will become more deadly. Now that's just one example, but there are lots and lots of ways that you can use Grand Illusion to mess up your opponent's tactics. Such as, say, you deploy first, you put the monolith or you put your big stuff, your ghost arcs, etc. on one side of the battlefield, your opponent then sets up to counter, you can then move that stuff anywhere else, and it will make your opponent really have to struggle to be able to target your big heavy things early game. Which of course, if you can have your opponent wasting time early game, you've got them on the back pedal from word go, and they're going to be trying to play catch up, and it sort of puts them into a bit of a mental lock, which can make their decision making very, very poor in some circumstances. I have met very, very few players that are able to overcome this sort of mental lock in a game and to be able to make the best choices that they can make. There are a few that can do it, but the majority of the time, people are not going to be able to overcome that sort of change around early game unless they're expecting it. If it's an opponent that plays you a lot and they know that you like to bring the Deceiver and do that, they're going to be expecting him, and you're not going to be able to take them off guard as easily. But if you're in like a tournament environment, you might be able to catch them by surprise every now and then. And of course, like the Nightbringer, he also has powers of the Catan, which we talked about, and he explodes on a 4-up when he dies. Which, D3 mortal wounds, not a huge deal for Necrons, because if you're bubble wrapping him with Scarabs, they've got 3 wounds apiece, who cares? Bubble wrapping with Warriors, they've got reanimation. 3 Warriors, who cares? Unless of course the Warrior squad is heavily depleted when he blows up, then that's just bad. But generally speaking, the Warrior squad's probably going to be blasted away before they're even able to shoot at the Deceiver, so not a big deal. In my experience, when Satan Shards explode, they're far, far more likely to be dealing mortal wounds against enemy models than against friendly models. Okay, so I just have one more tip that I want to make with these guys, and when I do this, I use both the Deceiver and the Nightbringer. I'll take a couple of units of Scarabs, and here's how this strategy goes down. You put both the Deceiver and the Nightbringer at the front of your deployment, so they're out in the open. Your opponent will then see that you're making a mistake and will hopefully move to try to counter your mistake and exploit it early on. Obviously, not going to work that brilliantly against opponents that are familiar with the Deceiver, because they will smell the trap coming a mile off, but against those who are less familiar, it's quite effective and rather hilarious. So you have them out the front. The idea is you want to position the Deceiver and the Nightbringer in such a way that your opponent leaves a gap in their deployment. So put them both either to one side to wait your opponent to that side, or split them up to try to make so your opponent leaves a gap in the middle. Personally, I like to put them both to one side, as I find that is more reliable. And then you will be rolling for your Deceiver's relocate, so it relocates him plus D3. So you're going to relocate him plus at least one other, and you come up with a 1 on your D3. I'd take some Scarabs so you can keep him bubble wrapped when he gets up close. But if you get a 2 or a 3, then you can take him, some Scarabs, and the Nightbringer, or possibly another unit of Scarabs if you get lucky, and you deploy them into the gap that your opponent has left. Now, turn 1, they cannot charge, but they can move. So you can start moving them towards your enemy to get a reliable charge in turn 2, and you bring the scarabs with you to keep them bubble wrapped. So if you only get 2 and you're taking the Nightbringer and 1 unit of scarabs with you, then you want to make sure that you take your biggest unit of scarabs and you put the Nightbringer and the Deceiver close together and you bubble wrap the heck out of them with the scarabs, because they are going to be a big target for your opponent very early on. And then you move towards the enemy, and once you get to your turn 2, you can charge and you literally have 2 pieces of gods right in your opponent's face. Turn 2. Very, very effective. A bit of a gamble if you're against more experienced players, but against players that are not familiar with the Deceiver, very, very lethal. And if you are up against players that are familiar with the Deceiver, then you need to make it so that they have no choice but to deploy in a way that leaves a gap open. So you can do that by, say, putting a monolith with them and having all 3 grouped together way over on the side, or putting some heavy destroyers or something that is a valuable priority 1 target for your opponent. Of course, keep in mind that you are probably making that thing a sacrificial unit in that case. So try to keep it something cheap. So obviously don't use a monolith, or do. I mean, it's quite durable, and if that's the role of the monolith in your army, is to just soak up wounds, then it could add to the tactic a bit more. It all depends on how you use the unit that you're adding there to try to influence your opponent's deployment, because ultimately what you want is that gap to be able to pop your Satan shards in and wreak havoc early game. And of course, this strategy works better with larger units of scarabs, which is quite achievable given how cheap scarabs are. They are the ultimate bubble wrap for Necrons. So there you go. There are some of the tips and tricks that I use when I'm deploying the Deceiver in 8th edition 40k. And ultimately, his real power is in the tricks that he plays in your opponent's mind early game and throws them off their rhythm very early. It's a very powerful tool to use, as, like I said, I've not met many players that have the mental fortitude to be able to deal with that sort of spanner in the works early on. And coupling him with the Nightbringer and a couple of scarabs, very, very lethal, especially if your opponent is not expecting it. And that's where a bit of pre-game psychology can come in, and you can make it so that your opponent is really left guessing as to what your plan is. So, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up so we know that you like it, so we can keep making stuff that you like. And if you have any suggestions for anything wargaming related you'd like us to talk about, then chuck it in the comment section below. I'd love to hear from you. And as always, if you want to improve your wargaming, make your tabletop battles more epic, and give your wargaming budget more power, then be sure to smash the crosshair and ding the bell. You'll subscribe and I'll be able to share with you more battle reports, terrain tutorials, and strategies to make your wargaming experience more epic. And I'll see you next time.